Good afternoon. It's Lee Cassidy from Tactile Technology, and we've got a great webinar for you today where we're talking about cyber readiness, but also looking at risk management as well. I've got two great speakers joining me today, so let me bring in. We've got Nick Kathman from Logic Gate, and we've got Kent Wilson from SimSpace. Good morning, I should say, to you two, because you're still in the morning stages of the day, whereas we're in the afternoon.
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Lee.
So what would be good to kick us off then is a quick introduction to yourself, a little bit of history to your career, and also maybe a short piece on what you're doing at Logic Gate. Do you want to kick us off, Nick?
Sure. Hey, Lee and Kent, it's nice to see you guys again today. For everybody else on the call I haven't met, my name is Nick Kathman, and I'm the new CISO at Logic Gate, creators of the automated GRC platform called Risk Cloud. I'm relatively new and recent. I joined the team a few weeks ago, and bring over 20 years of cybersecurity experience working with companies like Dell, Virtustream, RSA, and more, and managing security and compliance and highly regulated workloads.
And tell us a little bit about Logic Gate specifically then. So what do you think is bringing to the party around cyber readiness and risk management?
So if you're not familiar with what Logic Gate does, it's kind of an all-in-one platform for GRC and risk management. So it'll, when it comes to controls management and risk management like this, you can track your risks in it and quantify the risks to better show them to and explain them to different executives and different stakeholders within the organization. But then you can also put risk treatment plans around them and track control frameworks and track residual risk and actually use it as an automated platform to go out and track each one of these things and then seamlessly create many relationships back to your compliance frameworks and your internal governance and your internal audit. So it becomes an all-in-one type of platform to bring all of these solutions together and tie everything together.
Okay. Kent, give us a pre-save of yourself.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Kent Wilson. I'm Vice President of our Solutions Engineering program here at SimSpace. I got my start over 20 years ago. I was a gunfighter in the Army, and then got dragged or had the privilege of actually transitioning into cybersecurity. Several of my colleagues at the time had moved into the threat intel space. And so I helped them create and build out an organization at Symantec called the Cyber Threat Analysis Program. And we focused pretty heavily at the time on fusion analysis and working with our three-letter agencies to really improve the overall adjudication of some of the intelligence that they had. So was able to shift from there into helping Rapid7 build out a wonderful federal program, moved again into a small Incutel funded company to work with other intelligence agencies on the problem of network traffic analysis. And then had this great chance to come here to SimSpace where, at the end of the day, every conversation I'm having with a CISO, they're out there trying to create readiness baselines. They're out there trying to create these high performing teams with limited resources or making big product decisions. And so now I get the chance to help security leaders and our Department of Defense create those baselines, build those teams, and make these big decisions through the use of high fidelity range environments designed to provide a place for these teams to experience their worst day in cyber in a very consequence-free way.
Okay, well, I've got a similar background to Kent, but a little bit further back. We're not looking 20 years back, we're looking 43 years back. I was in the military, I was in the Royal Air Force in flight simulation. So flight simulation is all about evaluating people, processing technology, but also putting people through repeated activity that they can get to the point where they feel comfortable with it when it happens for real. So you don't want to put someone in a jet and fail an engine in that jet for the first time. You want it to be simulated multiple times. So when it happens for real, you know what to do. The stress level's lower because you've been through the process before. And that might come up in some of the conversations we talk about today, because it's similar in a cyber world, this, ensuring people are not doing it for the first time. But kicking off, what we're looking at is how we can assess and validate both our and also quantify our cyber environment. So it's quite important that we are prepared for anything that's going to happen, especially the unknowns in cybersecurity. And we've got a plan in place that we can use to actually make sure that the business is as secure as it could be, but also any risks that we've got are identified. So one of the first things I'd like to talk about, setting the stage, is we know what we know. We know currently what we don't know in some cases, but there are also things we don't know as well. But what are the kind of things that keeps you awake at night, and your peers, you think, with this current situation in cybersecurity?
Sure. I think, when folks that I'm having conversations with, I'll tell you right now, the CISO roles, it's just not an enviable position for anyone these days. But the big question is, what am I ready for? So the challenges that we're continuing to see everyone facing, and if you believe Gartner and ISC Squared and some of the other reporting agencies out there, there's still a 2.7 million person gap for cybersecurity roles, and folks are dealing with more than 78% of organizations are dealing with more than 40 products that they have to try in their security stack to align. There's this massive growth and destructive and expensive attacks. I think what we're seeing is this massive dearth in cybersecurity professionals operating as a big challenge. There's this, and that would be a known challenge. The continued development of these sophisticated ransomware and APT actors. And then this idea of the attack surface changing very much. So we're seeing digital transformation creating these new or poorly understood attack surfaces. OT, IoT, supply chain is another one that we continue to see a lot in the news, and people trying to evaluate whether they're part of a supply chain or just on the receiving end of that. And then, of course, the development of tools like ChatGPT is an example, AI, ML-led attacks, and all of that then funnels back into how am I managing the regulation of or preparing myself for the looming regulation that we see out there. So I see those as being big change agents for a lot of what people are dealing with in the new year.
Yeah, I think resource, money, and time are a massive problem for a lot of organizations. They can't find the people, they can't afford the people, and they don't have enough resources to do the things they want to do. And we're seeing new types of attack every day, aren't we? Recently we've seen this large amount of attacks against the EXI infrastructure on VMware, when there was an exploit identified and people haven't patched. So massive things there. What about your thoughts then, Nick?
Yeah, so I think the thing that I apologize. I'm still getting over pneumonia here, so I might be coughing and clearing my throat a lot. But I think the thing that keeps me up at night, and I think keeps a lot of other CISOs up at night, is really which you mentioned, the unknown unknowns. So it's really easy to keep a risk register, and so understand adversary modeling and risk modeling, things like that, and know where your risks are. But it's where the new things get introduced to you. As well as just the new methods that attackers use. So like the introduction of, last year we started to see a lot more of the triple espionage. They'll hit you with ransomware, and then you pay the ransom, and they'll hit you again to pay to not release your data, and then they'll sell your data anyway to your customers. So they essentially hit you with a triple whammy. But the things that keep me up a lot, especially when it comes to cyber readiness, is just the last place I ever want to be in is in a critical incident. And I've never actually done that critical incident, or never actually practiced that critical incident, or never been through one, and the lessons you're going to learn as part of that. So an example of this being, I was as part of an attack simulation a while ago. There was, during the response of it, the blue team was completely remote. The forensics agencies that we work with were completely remote, and collaboration was key. And the attackers took down AD, and with it took down the Teams infrastructure, the Slack infrastructure, the email. So now, everybody's scrambling to go try to find contact lists, which are in SharePoint, which is also encrypted. And they're chasing down people via text messages and, LinkedIn and stuff like that. So it took setting up a whole new communications infrastructure to then start the response to the actual incident, and added 2 days to the incident timeframe. And that would be an unknown that if you didn't go through this scenario and you didn't, pre-plan for this, there's no way you'd ever know.
Yeah, and so, some of this is a bit like military tactics, isn't it? If you put smoke on the battlefield, you can't see where the offensive attack's coming from. So they're doing similar things by taking away ability to communicate and find the information that you use to go through your playbooks and things like that. So there's an old adage, isn't there? Proper planning prevents poor performance. As cybersecurity business leaders, How do you think we can actually translate what we talk, cyber speak, into a common language that the business leaders can understand? Because sometimes they're not as invested in what we're trying to achieve as they could be, because sometimes they don't understand what we're actually talking about. So do you want to kick us off with that, Nick?
Sure. So I think the big part of this is understanding the stakeholders, understanding the audience, and understanding the terms they use, and also just how to stack rank what is a cyber risk or a security risk in terms of what they're doing. So an example that I've given before and that I've heard before was and I was actually part of, is we in a previous life there was a GRC person explaining a risk to the ELT at a company, and in big, critical, bold, red, blinking font on the spreadsheet or on the PowerPoint said critical risk. And it was just a miss of a single finding on a PCI audit of, for 1 out of 10 different compliance certifications we had or compliance programs we had. And after really digging in on it, the CEO stopped him and was like, look, we don't have enough money to hit payroll next week. That's a critical risk. If something isn't going to take the company down within 2 weeks, it's not a critical risk. So really understanding, who the audience is, who you're speaking to, not overblowing things. But an example being, if you're going to talk to the CEO, they're worried about loss of revenue. The chief product or the chief people officer might be worried about insider threats. The chief revenue officer is looking at loss of prospects. The chief financial officer is looking at annual loss expectancy. The marketing, chief marketing officer is looking at brand reputation. So really, it's just understanding all of those different, understanding how to explain the risk to each of those stakeholders in language they understand, so that they can get behind it and help in any way they can.
What about you, Ken? What's your thought about this?
Well, I just have to sort of echo what Nick has said there. I come back to always trying to leverage the language of the receiving party here, and so when we're talking in terms of business, it almost has to be in terms of dollars, and it has to be in terms, and those dollars end up being pushed into, are they direct costs? Are they costs that come from fines and regulation? Are they costs that come from loss of business due to some outcome from the security side of the house? It's really funny. For every business, it's going to be different too. I can give you some fun examples of like organizations that we've worked with in the past. There was an MSSP that we were working with, and they had an MDR team. I mean, one of the risks that they have is actually working with other people's security posture. There was an instance of an individual who was running through an event with us, and they had spotted some interesting lateral movement taking place in the environment, and had decided that they were going to go ahead and, in this exercise, the lateral movement was all being conducted using PowerShell. They decided, hey, we're going to go ahead and kill PowerShell to every one of these users using the EDR tool that's in place. And I just laugh, and this ties back kind of to these bigger language problems. This person was trying to solve a very tactical problem. They actually did a change request in this exercise, and they were able to stop and say, okay, the business impact of actually removing PowerShell from a team of application designers is going to have a huge business impact. It's going to affect our reputation, our brand. And so even in the defense of these environments, there are decisions that can be made that can have massive business impact. So it's really important for everyone to understand those and put those in terms of what they mean from a dollar perspective and a business impact.
So we've talked about the language issues and trying to put across the risk to the business leaders. What do you think the real blockers are in getting these strategies that we believe are going to protect our business, and move forward with these business leaders? What do you think the really biggest impact's going to be from a blockage? And also think about the environment that we're moving into now, because it is a rapidly changing environment. Nick, do you want to kick it? Oh, Kath, Ken, go for it.
Sure. Well, I think at the end of the day, we've already talked about this notion of people, process, technology, right? So we know that the talent pool is quite small today, that the training is limited out there. The ability for people to demonstrate proficiency and tie what they've done in the real world back to the way that they're aligned with roles in their organizations. All of those things are challenging today. So some of the big blockers out there are just a place for people to demonstrate their capabilities. we talk about some of the big blockers in massive technology budgets. There aren't silver bullets out there from a technology perspective. And there's so many folks continuing to make decisions on the promise of a technology that's going to solve XYZ. But, they're left spending a lot of money trying to manage very large chunks of infrastructure and applications. And these become blockers when there's not a way to actually validate or test the people, the process, the technologies in their day-to-day and in anger.
Okay. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I would also echo what Kent said. And that in, I mean, I think, in terms of strategies and what we've been doing and things like that, things like zero trust has existed for 20 years. It's a newly branded term. 20 years ago, we called it the Cadbury effect, the hard shell GUI center, and we started building around it. But I think what we have now is just a bunch of vendors jumping onto it, all offering silver bullets that in many cases, they only deliver a really small part of the problem, or they're not a part of the problem at all, and they're just trying to rebrand to it. So really what I get down to is it's, since we're using a lot of war analogies, it's almost like unilateral warfare. It's to send the spear phishing email is free for the attacker. And then we spend 200 grand trying to do spear phishing attempts and content filters and, spear phishing simulations and all these different things like that to try to defend against that. And then when you do that over and over and over again, you essentially the executives lose apathy for it. So now we've spent so much money trying to protect against a whole bunch of things that just are free or really easy for attackers to hit us with, and there's no incentive for them not to. So I call it embrace the incident. Know that incidents are going to happen, and just try to make sure that when you're designing your solutions and designing your environments and testing your people and processes, that the impact of the incident is going to be contained down to the smallest blast radius, and it's the smallest impact. So you can detect it quick, contain it quick, recover quick, get back to business, and just know that you're going to be constantly having incidents, but none of them are going to be very large, or hopefully none of them are very large. And this is where you can use simulations to actually test out exactly how large of these environments are going to be. And then other than that, it's just the silver bullet thing. There is no silver bullets. It's to the sprawl that Kent was talking about. 40 products, and each one of them is implemented 10% of the way. And they're all, in a lot of cases, they don't work together. And then one of them has an API change that then breaks integration with the other one. So what you end up with is teams that are constantly chasing, tools integrations and just keeping the care and feeding of those tools up before they can actually even use the tools for what they're designed for.
Yeah, I'd add to that too. I mean, this isn't because these organizations are lazy in their implementation. It's because there's a significant business impact in testing the tools and controls to failure. It simply can't be done in these production spaces a lot of times. And so really putting things through their paces requires a space to again, really experience that worst day in cyber.
Yeah, and say it's quite interesting. We've been getting these silver bullets for many years now that are going to fix all our problems, from a technology perspective in cyber. But none of them really do fix the problem. But when you get to the point where you've got 40 silver bullets, it's getting challenging now to know where to be looking, what to be doing, and trying to make the things work together. But the other thing is, how often do we validate those silver bullets that they actually do what they say they do? Because sometimes we've not got the ability to be even, understand if they're working, because if they're missing detections, if they're some kind of EDR, XDR type tool, if they're missing detections, we don't know about it unless we're actually feeding the detections, the actual threats in there in the first place. So, it's an interesting world we're in at the moment. So moving on, we have this like war games mentality, tabletop exercise. This kind of stuff's been done for thousands of years. If we look at the Chinese, the Japanese, they were going through reiterations of planning and testing things out and coming up with strategies for war gaming well before we were wearing trousers in the UK, especially, and things. It was it's been going on a long time. We still do tabletop exercises in cyber at the moment, and we do some other types of exercises, but a lot of these are quite theoretic, aren't they? So they're a bit of a challenge. So what can we do to change that? What approaches can we do to actually use, say, a cyber range to actually make it a bit more realistic? But also, are there differences between different cyber ranges that are available today? Do you want to start with that, Kent? Because that's more your area.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. I think I'll start with one of my favorite quotes from a customer, which is that there's nothing more satisfying than seeing a new attack for the second time. This comes from this idea that if you plan properly and as new attacks are levied against you, or if you understand the tactics, techniques, and procedures that your adversaries are leveraging, you can really attempt to get ahead of the game here and find yourself in a situation of, or a position of power as these attacks are taking place. So, are all ranges created equally? I think, at the end of the day, and one of the things we've seen with our largest customer, which is our U.S. Department of Defense, is that no, they're not. In fact, there's a requirement, we know this from military exercises, Lee, you and I think, and Nick as well, that at the end of the day, rehearsals are incredibly important, and rehearsals are not just thinking through the exercise, but actually getting boots on the ground and maneuvering units and experiencing that and understanding the types of pitfalls that are going to exist as you start to really bring these forces together and operate them in tandem with each other. Our CRO, Ross Brewer, talks a lot of times about, national teams in football or national teams in rugby, and how, as you bring these groups of great players together, a lot of times they don't necessarily all work well together. So sometimes it's the first time that some of these folks are playing together. And we see this happen in a lot of enterprise organizations where they're hiring the best in breed for each of these different roles. And they're challenged then by getting them to work together. So we have a great customer we call the bank, and the bank has been using ranges now to really uncover gaps in their own security posture. And one of the first things that they found themselves doing was full-scale assessments, but having threat presentations run over different periods of time. And first and foremost, they realized that their shift changes became this really critical moment from an adversary perspective to get in. And so they realized that during their shift changes, their case management wasn't being handled properly. People weren't transitioning tickets across equally. Cases that were being handed off from one group to the next were not always picking up where they were left off. And it created this opportunity for the adversaries to really take advantage of those lulls in diligence. And so, a lot of improvement that can be taking place there, but they're not ever going to experience that without having gone through those steps and physically transitioned those cases from one group to the next. So we see these opportunities as to practice process and procedure, make sure that it's the right thing, but to start to get objective measures around how people are performing, and then to be able to use those as a baseline to continuously improve those over time. And, so I think we see that as a huge difference between the notion of a tabletop exercise and then actually physically getting in there and participating in, a real world rehearsal of that terrible event.
Nick, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I would echo a lot of that. I mean, I haven't done a cyber warfare range assessment myself, but I've judged what's called CCDC, the Collegiate Cyber Defense Competitions, which are kind of limited scope versions of cyber warfare for a number of years, throughout the New England and East Coast area. And in a lot of cases, you go in there, you threat model, you do your risk modeling, your risk management, you do your adversary modeling, you figure out what the capabilities are, but without having been attacked by a sophisticated third party where it's no holds bar and there's no rules, you won't know a lot of these things. As well as you get into an incident, and it's really common for especially like large enterprises and critical infrastructure to have many vendors that are pulled in to manage a single solution. So an example of this is during a live incident, a customer that I used to work with, they had a SQL server that was part of critical national infrastructure at the time, and a web application and systems and database and everything like that. And different companies were actually managing the different parts of the stack. And there was a security incident, and we had to pull in all of the different vendors to bring it in. And what we learned through the process was, change management was different for each of them. Some of them could put it under a blanket emergency change and track changes and then go back and review them postmortem. Some required an emergency change review for each one of them. And it slowed things down a lot. But then to Kent's thing, once there was a shift change, it was a very abrupt shift change, and handing off the information usually didn't go well. And if it did go well, the quality of the engineer coming online may not be as good as the person who's leaving. So in the middle of a database restore, if the person coming online to take them has only done it 10 times and the person who was leaving has done it 300 times, you've now just shot yourself in the foot. And this is something that you're going to learn very heavily through an actual thing like this. Like another example that I had was, in one of these DC competitions, many years ago, there was actually, the teams came in, some of these teams are extremely good defenders. And, they had really good Linux forensics. They had really good Windows forensics. And there was even some Solaris stuff in there that they were really good at analyzing. And then one of the testers found a 0-day in PHP, a hash collision PHP 0-day, and actually developed the exploit and used it during the middle of the 2-day contest or the competition. And it completely took down every team. And none of the teams had anybody with any type of web reversing experience to actually figure out what was going on. It became a big gap that essentially knocked all of the teams out of the competition for the entire rest of the competition. And that's not something that you would ever, you would think you would have that knowledge internally, and you would look at, what certification somebody has and, what knowledge they have. But until they've actually been put into the situation of having to analyze a 0-day in real time without a bunch of other, analysts that are helping to analyze that in, over the course of weeks, it's something, it's one of those unknown unknowns that you're going to learn that you would only learn through a cyber warfare type of thing.
Yeah, and say the couple of things in there as well is I've lost train of thought there for a second, but under stress conditions, people change. So when you get in a stress situation, you don't think as straight as you could do. And I come back to some of the pieces about time immemorial of doing these things. If you look where a lot of the cyber range technology comes from, it's the behavioral patterns of what people do in military around training. So red flag was introduced because fighter pilots in Vietnam were being shot down much more often than they were prior to that, because they haven't actually fought for quite a long time. You spend time getting them through multiple engagements, and they actually start to exponentially improve in performance. And that's where flight simulation became a big thing. Red flag became a very big activity that was done across multiple parts of the military, predominantly the air forces, so US Air Force, Royal Air Force, and some of the other European nation forces as well. But you could see through, let's say, practice, more chance of you surviving when it came to real. And I think, Kent, you mentioned earlier about, wouldn't it be better to actually, experience this for the second, third, fourth, or fifth time when it's real, rather than just the first time? You don't want a APT-40 exploit first time engagement. You want it, many periods on that you've done it so many times you could do it in your sleep. It makes a difference.
There's no substitute for it. And in fact, I mean, it's really interesting you bring up red flag too, because that is almost foundational to SimSpace's beginnings, in that we're coming out of cybercom, we're coming out of it from an organization that's trying to shift those paradigms that we learned in the air, land, and sea warfighting domains into cyber. And it's one of the biggest challenges I think that our commercial and enterprise partners have is just that in the DoD, we were afforded, or in the military, we were all afforded the opportunity to train 70% of the time, and 30% of that time is actually operational or on objective. And so when you don't have that opportunity, if you're in the knife fight all day, every day, how do you pull yourself out? But how can you afford not to pull yourself out and train? So this is something we should have probably talked about at the outset with respect to challenges, but it's a real challenge for our commercial teams.
Yeah. So let's talk about, rangers themselves then. So I'm going to put up a slide in a second, but, one thing is having, say, a bit of your infrastructure, like a lab environment you could create, and you could, start putting threats in there, but you've got little control and scale with that as well. There are other, solutions out there that people could use, to create a cyber range. But again, it doesn't have that fidelity. So if I put a slide up, if you want to talk to, what the benefit of being able to actually create a realistic copy of an organization's infrastructure and place that into a range to be used, and what the benefits are there.
Sure. Well, I think the value of these high fidelity range spaces can't really be overstated. I know we talked a little bit about a second ago about the different types of competitions and other pieces that are out there. But at the end of the day, if you're not working with your own tools in your own space, kind of seeing the same types of traffic that you see in your own environment, you're not really practicing for the real thing. And so when we talk about what a military grade cyber range is, and this is based on years of working with the persistent cyber training environment and some of the other DoD entities and government entities that we have an opportunity to train with, it comes back to really breaking out the range into 6 of its basic components. At this most basic layer, and you mentioned this development or lab environments, we need to be able to create emulated or virtualized replications of the infrastructure that we're working in. So that's your compute, your software-defined networking, the virtual machine images that an organization might use to mimic their own space. And then on top of that, we need to layer in all of the applications that exist in those environments. And so if, I don't know the last time anyone actually pulled together on the call here, pulled together a domain controller or an Exchange server, or any of those pieces, but that stuff can take a very long time, as well as configuring all the different networking, firewalling, and pieces like that. So being able to do that quickly and repeatably so that you can actually go in, destroy these things and rebuild them is a critical piece to building out a military grade cyber range. And then being able to tie in this lowest layer, being able to tie in the physical systems. So a lot of folks are worried now and are trying to develop test beds for their operational technology or their IoT in the convergence zones that exist between that infrastructure, their IT infrastructure and their OT infrastructures. So you need to not only be able to emulate these things, but you need to be able to plug them into real systems when the situation calls for it. So when we look at those bottom 3 layers, it might feel like a test bed or a lab environment, but the very first thing that everybody runs out of when they build their own development and lab environments is space. And so again, having the ability to scale these things from 10 systems all the way out to thousands of systems is a really important piece. The next piece of things when we talk about ranges is having these, guaranteed safe spaces, but also that now that you've created this big sterile environment, how do I get it to look and feel like a real range or a real network environment that I'm used to working in? And so to do that, you need to use user emulation. You need to put bots on every one of these systems, or we've worked with people in the past that have done this with people, very inefficient, but being able to create people in those environments that are doing all of the things that their normal workforce does. So sending emails, responding to emails, clicking the links that they're not supposed to, going to websites, going to websites they're not supposed to, interacting with internal web applications, all those different pieces. So being able to drop these bots onto these systems and create that telemetry for the defensive tools that need to be sifted through. We now start to generate the noise in an environment that people have to work through in order to see the signal from the attacks. Being able to automate attacks is another key feature for a modern cyber range today. So having the ability to launch attacks at different times, create threat presentations of varying sophistication are really important to creating that self-sufficient space for these events. And so we then talk about, now that you've got your emulation layer and you've got your activity layer, now there's this participation layer that we talk about, and being able to have your red teams, your blue teams, your purple engagements, but your assessors being able to look over the shoulder at the individuals working in this space is another really key component to what we would consider to be a military grade cyber range. And then finally, of course, instrumenting all of that data that's coming out of this space into meaningful objective metrics. So we can now measure our defensive success rates. We can measure and use those sorts of measurements to describe what we think potential losses might look like, but more importantly, to build out a continuous improvement program with these ranges. So coming in, running events, and you might start a conversation with 400,000 different systems that you want to have in consideration for the event. But at the end of the day, it's also about compressing that into what the most meaningful components of that space are, so that you can balance fidelity, and the administrative overhead of running massive events in these spaces. So
We've had a comment about how somebody does it at the moment, and what he's saying, he actually uses Terraform, Packer, PowerShell, and Python to do a lot of this, and he does it in AWS and Azure. But what would you say to that? Is that giving a realistic environment? Is that giving them everything they need to to create a cyber range that we see as a cyber range?
Well, I mean, I think infrastructure as code is the way you translate these things into these environments. So absolutely, those are incredibly valuable ways. And I'd be lying if I didn't say we use a lot of these same techniques to develop these cyber ranges. So, I guess spot on. That's exactly the type of thing that you want to be doing in your own space. And it now comes down to this conversation of scale. And then I go back to that user emulation and being able to create those living, breathing environments. That's the real challenge. So, to a large extent, creating the spaces is the first step. But this next step is creating that living, breathing environment that aligns with your own corporate configurations and gives you a chance to really practice techniques in the space. So This is...
Yeah, and so I thought I'd put this slide up as well, because it gives people a bit of a view of what a range might look like and the components on it.
Yeah, this is fantastic. This is a great little diagram. It's a small range. This is an example of a template that we would use maybe to start a conversation with a financial organization, saying, hey, here we've gone ahead and we've got some OT in the form of ATMs living in this space. We've got really all of the complex networking that exists, where we've got systems communicating over one DMZ, corporate actors participating over other DMZs. We've got payment systems in here that allow us to simulate interbank transfers. We've got all the various lines of business. And then from a security perspective, we've included the security stack of the organization here in this space as well. So, being able to drop in from your firewall perspective, the Palos that you're used to working with, or having your operators working on Splunk or any of the other SIM tools that are out there, or source solutions that are out there, bringing that into this space allows people to have deeper engagements and repeatable, tie things really closely to the production environments that they're working in.
Okay, so over to you then, Nick. What are your thoughts about having more of a realistic environment like this within a cyber range? How do you think that gives value to an organization?
Well, the one that sticks out in my mind very, very clearly is, early in my career I worked a lot in petrochem and so with PLC DCS systems and things like that. And there's they're always connected to the IT systems in some way. So examples of actual projects that I've worked on is if there was a pump that the vibration sensor on the pump started going out of calibration or started, hit some threshold, it would automatically, through the PLC DCS system and the vibration sensors, open a maintenance, like a preventative maintenance ticket, which would then also call SAP to go get a pick list of parts to assign out to, qualified individuals and things like that. So it was a really powerful plant automation, like plant preventative maintenance automation workflow, but now it meant that there had to be IP connectivity between your DCS system and your corporate environment. Another example is, the plants are always monitoring, output, waste, how much energy goes in, and all of this is coming back into their financial models so they can track on a daily basis, profit and loss, or, some other metrics, like key metrics that they have inside there to know exactly what's going on. But now, so now you've tied in these automation systems and the PLC DCS systems, but those are very, very, very stringently controlled and operated in different ways than the normal IT infrastructure. So I know a lot has changed since I did this, but back in the day, the largest manufacturer for PLC DCS systems, it only ran on Windows, and it ran on really old versions of Windows, and every single patch against Windows had to be evaluated and by the vendor, and they were usually about a month behind. And then you had to download the patches from the vendor website. You couldn't use something like WSUS. So if you patched Windows for long enough, some of the patch Tuesdays would come in and you'd have 300 patches. And you're having to go to the vendor's website every day and see which ones they've approved. And if there's a dependency chain, it wasn't always clear. So those industrial control systems were always lagging behind. And now you're going into So now you're exiting the realm of, in security, I always say there's loss of data and then there's loss of life. In loss of data, somebody steals your data. Worst case, it's, or I don't think worst case, but, an example is somebody steals a bunch of PII. Okay, then you have to go report it to all of the different regulatory agencies, the state agencies, the governments, and then you have to pay for credit monitoring and things like that. It's a recoverable event. In the case of like an ICS system, if they can make changes to parameters on the PLC DCS systems, they can cause an explosion at a plant, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars to resolve and is actually very, very expensive. And the loss of life. So being able to get in there and actually emulate and simulate parts of that are very, very powerful. I mean, just look at the IoT with the Home Depot breach, where they got in via the HVA system. An exact example of an unknown that would be really easy to tease out in this case.
And so when we think of OT, we're always thinking about something that might be physical, like a relay that controls, water flow, power flow, things like that. And we're thinking that side of thing, or PLCs like we just talked about. But they could also be air conditioning systems. So, if someone hacked into the OT infrastructure for all your air conditioning for a data center and shuts down all the air conditioning, that could be a major incident. Everything's going to overheat, everything's going to be off. If you got into a train system's signaling platform and start to actually change the signaling, you could stop trains. You could even, if you knew what you were doing, create a collision. You could create power outages in the power system. You could create problems with water utilities. There were many things you could do that could cause mayhem within a country, by taking over OT infrastructure and dealing with there. And coming back to some of the PLCs, they are really challenging, some of them, because some of them still run on Windows XP. We're not talking about Windows 7, 10 or 11. We're looking at really old infrastructure, some of these PLCs.
But on System 5.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and if we look at a finance organization, that OT might be ATMs. Those NCR ATMs, thousands sat out there that people are using every day. If they could take control of those, there could be anything they could do, including potentially spitting money out of them. But I'm not sure if that's a realistic thing you could do. But, if you stopped operation of ATMs for a whole bank's ATM infrastructure, I think there'd be a few challenges, in the community.
Yeah, I actually think there was a Black Hat talk probably 5-7 years ago doing exactly that, taking an old ATM system and having it spit money. So it's possible.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
We've got a financial question. I think it might be a good time to drop this in. So, one was, how do you actually simulate a Swift environment? I think it's because when we had that diagram, we had a Swift section because it was a financial model, isn't it? So how would you simulate Swift in an environment to be able to do that?
So, at the end of the day, and I think we have to be careful, we say things like Swift-like systems. But the idea of simulating those, you have to start to create simulated interactions between the different payment systems. And we simulate those, and we try our best to define them and make them look and feel like they do within the actual banking organizations. And then what gets really interesting is the type of impact that intrusions can have on those systems, and what that means when a bank stops receiving payments from another, or things along those lines. So, I mean, the way you build that in is trying to create the same sort of, it might not need to be the exact same applications, but you want the outputs, and you want to try and define scenarios that are going to give your teams an opportunity to really exercise and build muscle memory around the way to respond to the observation that, maybe transfers aren't occurring the way they used to, or that you're seeing a backup of different things.
Okay, so my final piece, because we're running out of time of our main block here. So really, let's look at the quantification then. So we've run an LFE, so our live fire exercise. We've got an after action report that's given us loads of risk data. We hand that over to Logic Gate. How are we going to, take that information? How are we going to understand the risk, but also to be able to quantify that risk? I think that's a good one for you to start with, Nick.
Yep. So this is where, the platform like Logic Gate and the capabilities in Logic Gate actually shine, like beyond any other product out there. So, there's lots of platforms to track risk. There's not many of them that can quantify it. There's not many of them that can give you really fair models on it. So when it comes down to it is, what you're going to find in the output report of your LFE. You may say, okay, we detected 10 spear phishing attempts. That's great. But then you get the live fire report and they actually simulated 100 and you only caught 10%. So this is now going to go into, as you're building those fair models for your risks and trying to figure out what your annual loss expectancy, your min, max, average type of, dollar value loss on these things, bad data in, bad data out. So now you're starting to tweak that data and get higher fidelity on that data. So now you can say, okay, the likelihood of the exercise happening is actually higher than we realized. So in addition to our simulations showing that users are clicking it, and we now know that we're only catching 10%, we can make the assumption based on that the numbers are much higher. So the likelihood might go from a 2 to a 5, which then is going to raise the monetary impact, the financial impact of what that could be. So it'll let you go back and say, okay, then how can we reduce the impact? How can we make the blast radius smaller because we know we're at risk for it? And explaining that to executives and explaining that to people, like, this is, the reason we want to address this risk is because of, at a low end, it can cost us $50,000. At a high end, it can cost us $3 million, with an average cost of around $350,000. And we're really likely to have this happen to us. And we do all of this through what's called the FAIR model. And what you do is you input all the parameters that you have, as well as the new input that you're going to have from that live fire exercise. And then it's going to run a whole bunch of Monte Carlo simulations to figure out what your minimal loss, average loss, median loss, and your likely loss, maximum loss, all of that kind of stuff. And it's getting the data for these things is so challenging to actually get the good data in, because most companies don't actually detect things that are happening. I would say most attacks go undetected. So they just don't have, there's no good training models to go back and say, a company on the internet is attacked of this type of, or this size in this industry is attacked 1,000 times a day of these different types. They might only catch one every 6 months. So they think that, we're not a target, we're not being targeted, and they put the likelihood as low. So these types of events now give you the data in, so you can say, okay, that we are actually this is, we wouldn't catch these things. The likelihood is different, and that's going to give you much better modeling as you go.
Yeah, there is a big challenge there. And, so we talk about dwell time in the UK, that it's about 6 months for a lot of, especially the small to medium businesses. They may have been compromised, and it's 6 months before they know they're being compromised, because they don't have any sophisticated mechanism, threat hunting technology and things to understand that it's there in the first place. But again, large organizations, again, if they're not instrumented correctly, might not know about a threat at all. And like I say, it could be just 10%. What are your thoughts, Anne Kent, on that? How we can take that LFE data and we can actually help mitigate that risk, but also quantify the problem?
Well, I mean, just again, echoing everything that Nick has already said, but I think it's critical to, there's a lot of public data, or a growing body of data out there for organizations to baseline themselves based on the kind of the industry that they're in, the types of threats that are aligned to that industry, the techniques that they're using. But they don't take into account the configurations for the specific organizations. And so that's what's so critical about modeling these environments with your own people, your own process, and your own tooling, because it really does start to nuance what the likelihood of a particular event is going to be. And so, we continue to use terms like defensive success measures and other objective terms to define when we're picking up, or when our prospects and when people involved in the range exercises are identifying threats right out the gate, or whether they're missing things. We can speak to the severity or the sophistication of a particular attack. And, going back to kind of the exercises that the bank was conducting, one of the things that they uncovered and became actually the reasons that they were able to lower the cost of their cyber insurance was that when they continued to run these exercises over those shift changes, they were able to demonstrate in no uncertain terms that not only were they identifying more attacks, especially the ones that were being presented over those shift changes, but that they were improving the defensive success measures around the quantity that they were detecting and the sophistication of the threats that were being presented. And so those are really big pieces to improving, and that's, there's a practical outcome there where they're financially reducing their overhead by demonstrating these improvements to the program.
I think we've come to the natural end of my question, and the only thing to throw in there is it's not just a financial risk anymore. There's also potentially a compliance risk with anybody's FCA or other compliance piece, but the legal responsibility is increasing. That's both in the US and the UK. There are laws coming into place where anybody who's managing critical infrastructure, if they're not protecting that from cyber threat, they will be going to prison. And there's a good chance it's going to be buck stops at the CISO, because they're the top of the chain in that respect, but potentially it could go higher up to the CEO level in the organization. So we've got to take account of that. We're going to open it to questions. We've got a couple of questions coming. A statement here actually. So one thing that was said when we were talking about the IoT is about this is what the Israelis did. They actually attacked the OT, which is the Iranian centrifuges in their nuclear development site. So it can be done, and we've seen it more than not. And attacking something like a nuclear power station could be quite a scary piece. But we also got one from Venk, so who's asking, what guidance would you do for non-profits who are trying to improve their security posture? So do you want to kick that one off, Kent?
Certainly. I think at the end of the day, some of the things we're talking about require a level of maturity and sophistication to even begin. So at the outset, I think it's really important just to establish the security program that you're trying to build, to leverage the guides and tools that are out there for you, and then to bring organizations in, like SimSpace as an example, to provide your team an opportunity to experience or put those processes, those people, those technologies, and test them. And that can be done in a single event that can start to support this idea of a continuous improvement process. So there's no need to invest heavily in massive infrastructures to support a regular training piece, but rather I think we can focus efforts starting with things like individual training, but then very quickly moving into an understanding how your teams work together.
Yeah, and he's also put in a bit more context, being that non-profits, it's a tight on budget. They spend most of their focus on mission of doing good for other people, whatever the organization is. What about your thoughts, and Nick?
Yeah, so if this is Vanks from RSA, hi. I haven't seen you in forever. But yeah, I think on this, what it comes down to is, that every company is at a certain level on their security maturity model. And what you see a lot is companies in that center space of, they've gone from startup or early seed, and now they just have zero, usually zero tech people and zero security people completely, and they just don't know what to do. Tell me what to do. And then towards the center of the thing, towards the center of their maturity model, they tend to pick a framework, the NIST framework, or they'll pick SOC 2, PCI, FedRAMP, CMMC, whatever it's going to be, and then they build their security program around it. So I call it the tail wagging the dog. They're picking controls and they're implementing controls in their environment that in a lot of cases may not make sense. And then as they become more mature, they move to a risk-based model. And that's when they really look at it and say, we're a mean website. Everything that on our website is free to download, and it's not behind a paywall, it's not behind anything else like that. The $300,000 we spent on HSM probably wasn't a good investment. So my suggestion to you would be just, start with the risk-based approach from the very beginning. Don't make the mistake of the tail wagging the dog, and actually sit down and say, okay, what is the data we have? What is the impact if that data gets out? And what do we do to target and protect that? So, if you have some level, like some really important IP, and that IP doesn't need to be modified or seen very often. It's kind of just, think of it like the Coke secret sauce. They know what it's all programmed into all the assembly lines. It doesn't need to be on a SharePoint site somewhere. It can be in a USB drive, in a safe, inside of a cage behind
air gapped.
So start with that. Start with identifying where the risk is, and then targeted go after those approaches, knowing that you might have gaps in other parts of the other environment, but it'll be less impact.
And we also had a comment on the back of me going through the financial that reputational risk is a big one as well. So yeah, definitely. In fact, the reputational risk can also be much higher financially than the traditional financial risk to the business. We've got a couple of others. So let's jump in and find the first one here. So we've got, we've just established our first cybersecurity team at our organization, and what the program maturity stage would you recommend we invest in something like risk management platform or a cyber range? Is it ever too soon to start looking at that? So do you want to kick us off with that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I would always suggest starting off with a risk-based approach from the very beginning, and a risk management platform is going to make that much easier. Like trying to track the interdependencies inside of Excel spreadsheet quickly gets out of control, and essentially what happens is your risk management program just becomes a checkbox to something like ISO that says that I have to have it, and then you're not getting any actual value out of it. Having a platform that ties it in together to say, this is the risk treatment plan, it's tied to these controls, this is how often we identify, we test those controls, the automated testing of the controls and validation, it lets you know when that process is breaking down in a very succinct way that you're just not going to be able to get out of doing this in Excel spreadsheets. So I would say, risk management platform, I would invest earlier than not. And the cyber range, I would as well. So you're going to get a lot of value out of that exercise. I would start it pretty early.
Kent?
I would just echo again that there's you need to understand where you're living within this maturity model to make informed decisions. And so a good starting place is picking a framework that's going to be effective for the space that you're in. And is it ever too soon? Obviously without a team, a range is probably overkill. So I would just simply say that there are some points in that journey, that maturity journey, where it starts to really make sense to exercise your folks. And I think that becomes the point where a range makes a ton of sense. There's zero way to for an organization to understand how they're going to behave under stress without putting themselves in that situation. And so at the point where you've got a team of people and you want to be able to validate that your process and the tooling that you have is applicable to the problems that you're trying, or the threats that you're trying to prevent, that's the time to start bringing that range in. And early is better.
Yeah, and on the back of that, it's a great way to validate different technologies as well. So you could try it with one EDR platform and then swap it to a different one, run an exercise and see what the detection capabilities are with each one. So it's a great way to do it, because you wouldn't traditionally deploy across your whole production environment with a technology you're considering using, but a range allows you to do that in an easy and simple and safe way.
Yeah, I mean, double clicking on that, again, size matters here in the sense that if you haven't implemented massive change control, maybe it's simpler for an organization to go ahead and test a technology. But the moment you start bringing change control into the equation, or the moment that you're talking about a technology that's going to impact or have a potential business impact, so networking technologies and others, it really is important to have a space that you can just quickly go and implement these solutions and understand how they're going to work. So we see the ranges used as a wonderful test bed for new technologies, as a way of conducting evaluations, as a way of making determinations. I mean, making some really big decisions about pitting one technology against another, but having and knowing that they are all receiving the same inputs. Those are really valid and valuable use cases for cyber ranges.
I think we've got time quickly just for one more. So we had we run regular pen tests. How does the cyber range augment what we already do with our penetration testing? Do you want to kick off that, Nick?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're just going to get much more valuable information out of a cyber range. So the fact of it being non-destructive and they can actually leverage real attacks is going to be huge. Like every time you set up a new pen test with a company and you're pen testing an environment, you're setting up rules of engagement. So, a common rule of engagement is DDoS attacks are off limits. Like you don't,
Yeah.
there's a DDoS attack, they're going to take you down 9 times out of 10. So you don't want to, you don't want to have that as a attack scenario. Or if they get a credential, you don't want them to then lock, let's say they get a pen test we did a long time ago. We were using a vaulting product, and the vaulting products create seeds that unlock the vault, and they left them all in the root folder of the vault. So once the pen testers were able to get credentials, they got access to the vault, which had every password known to man. In a cyber range, you can cause all kinds of havoc with that, and you can essentially become the most powerful person in the entire environment. And again, like going back to the original example, lock the blue team, lock the defenders completely out, and make recovery an absolute nightmare. Whereas in a production environment, you just can't do that. So you don't understand what the actual impact of that vulnerability is, or that finding is. You can only make the mental stretch. Whereas in a cyber range, you'll know exactly what the output was in the same play.
I just can't understate the value of sort of the destructive testing that can take place in a cyber range versus the production space. So at the end of the day, you really can't understand what the impact of having different pieces go down, or play the chaos monkey sort of approach to your environment and remove things from people. We had a wonderful event not too long ago where this up and coming cyber leader was running his incident response team, and he went ahead and in the middle of this mitigation effort, so they'd contained the threat and they wanted to go ahead and start down some mitigation procedures, said, I'm going to go ahead and start taking these systems offline. And the event controller said, no, you can't take these systems offline. I need you to come up with a better way of doing that. And so even though like in a production environment, you might go ahead and isolate a particular system, these ranges also give you a chance to extend these situations beyond what's normal, and to really force people to exercise muscles that they don't necessarily get to utilize in their day-to-day production space. So Red Team is a fantastic tool to apply to a production environment, an even better tool to apply to a well-configured range.
I think we've run out of time. We're a couple of minutes over, but I just wanted to talk about this. So, we've gone through how you can look at understanding the cyber readiness you've got in your organization. We've looked at how we can actually do some risk management, take an output and understand and quantify that using LogicGate's Risk Cloud platform to get it into real figures. We can also use it then to educate the leadership in the business about the risk levels and quantify that risk into money. But also, what we want to do is extend the conversation to a smaller group of people. We're looking about 15 people to come to a cyber lunch at the Royal Air Force Club in Mayfair on the 23rd of February. So it will be an opportunity for people to come and network with their peers in the cyber industry, the cyber vertical within their organizations. But we're looking at 12 noon there for about 2 to 3 hours over lunch. And if you're interested in that, you can register using the link below. So https://tactiletechnology.com/cyber-lunch/registration, and we'll get those tickets out to you for those who register. But what I'd like to do is thank Nick and Kent for joining me today. So thanks ever so much for your insight, your knowledge, your experience. That was great. A lot of good comments coming back from our attendees saying how beneficial some of the information was. So thank you very much for that. And I will catch up with you both soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thanks.
Yeah, real pleasure. Bye.